About a year ago, when I released my bisexual vampire magnum opus, Twitter user @CemeterySwift wrote the following about it. Watching a video on bisexuality and vampirism where there's a whole half-hour section dedicated to My Chemical Romance. Oh, I'm sure. Well, guess what, user @CemeterySwift? This time, the My Chemical Romance vampire extravaganza is not going to be limited to just one chapter in the video. My name is Shasha, not Sasha. And finally, I'm here to deliver a somewhat coherent overview of the unique relationship between one of 2000's emo's most iconic bands and one of the most iconic gothic monsters. I mean, seemingly, MCR is not more vampire-pilled than any other big band of the era. After all, they don't even have a proper vampire music video, like, say, Fall Out Boy. So why is it that the Rogan cousins and company are so intertwined with the famed fiends in our collective consciousness? Really quick, let me establish my credibility when it comes to the topic. Here is 15-year-old me accidentally making a dick joke in front of Frank Iero. It's been 9 years, yet this still haunts me. And here's the picture that people use in Ferrari collages from the very same meet and greet. I'll have you know it was a reaction to my handmade Sweet Pea bookmark. I'm a versatile artiste, after all. Also, rest in peace, Sweet Pea. And here is, 16-year-old me taking a break at my then job. And as for vampires, let's just say I have very healthy and normal interest in them. Now, first and foremost, let me tell you about the things this video is not. This video is not a list of every MCR vampire connection or every mention of the blood-gobbling, sun-fearing beasts or themes in the band's discography or interviews. My goal is to establish an understanding of the place the shadowy vampire figure occupies, and fitting every textual and subtextual link between the two topics into a single video of a somewhat reasonable length is simply impossible. I mean, MCR is on tour right now, and by the time I'm done editing this, there's for sure going to be even more material. This is also not a definitive retrospective on the band's entire career, lore, and controversies, since I'm zoning in on this very specific topic. We're going to be jumping from album to album and era to era and back. Therefore, it will not be a good introduction to MCR, and I'm assuming you're entering this with some amount of basic knowledge about the band, its discography, and or history. I'm also assuming you're entering this having had at least one painful homosexual situationship that made you realize things about your gender, or alternatively, one painful homoerotic friendship that blew up in your face. I feel like without that, you cannot fully appreciate MCR's Vampireverse. Additionally, I will be directing my attention mostly towards Gerard Way as the lyricist and the main concept creative in the band, which should not be taken as me dismissing the artistry and contribution of the other band members.
And who are you? Gerard Way. And who's beside you, Gerard? Ray Toro.
I am beside Gerard Way.
Honestly, I just don't fucking know jack shit about guitar riffs and drum parts and cannot competently tie those into the discussion. And finally, this video is not going to be discussing Illy McMillan and the Bummer Clown and the things they make me feel. That is between me and the Red Hat doll wearing BDSM gear that I picked up at the goth thrift store. What we are going to do is examine the textual links between MCR and vampires, the visuals and the aesthetic interplay between the two, the great emo Twilight debacle, and, of course, the fanfic of it all. With that out of the way, before we unleash the bats, let's first see what state the vampire world was in at the turn of the millennia, and introduce the framework I'm going to be using throughout this video. Why do I sound so fucking serious? I have a fucking green screen now. We are a production. Because I need to make sense of the world and because I love a visual aid, I have developed a more or less coherent way to classify different types of vampires for this video, also known as the only valid political compass. I drew this while watching Blade, completely based on my vampire expertise, so I'd like to think that this is a Shasha Not Sasha original, but I could also be wrong, so let me know if I accidentally yanked this from somewhere. Look at this. I wanted to get a telescopic pointer, but the Euro store does not carry telescopic pointers anymore, so we got a bag scratcher. Along the x-axis, we have the nature of the character's relationship to vampirism. To the left, we have driven by vampirism, meaning the character's bloodsucker endeavors are inextricable from their very being. And to the right, we have cursed by vampirism, meaning the vampiric aspect is at odds with the character's humanity and or morality, and typically brings them more suffering than satiation. The y-axis is responsible for the sensual to violent spectrum, describing the nature of vampiric acts exercised by the character. I should also note that often, but not always, as we'll see throughout our exploration of the topic, sensuality equals hotness, while violence equals ugliness or repulsiveness. This classification is best used for singular characters, as many types of vampires are often present within the same universe. But the best way to explain this whole thing is to use it. So let me walk you through the very brief and very incomplete history of the vampire figure and its use over the centuries, and show where some of the most prominent bloodsuckers fall on this map. Now, horror as a genre is inherently political and sharp, seeing as it's a way to articulate and live through emotions and fears that might otherwise be taboo or buried under the surface of societal norms. And as Nina Auerbach points out in Our Vampires Ourselves, every age has its own vampire with notable differences from those that came before and will come after, because every age has its own anxieties and social tensions. Let's do a speed run through the history of vampires up to the early 2000s in order to see what the undead represented at the time of MCR's conception and rise to fame. So we all know that originally vampires were folkloric creatures, with an iteration of the bloodsucker myth or a similar creature existing in practically every culture, from Lamias in ancient Greece to the Dacian strigoi. Those ancient blood gulpers were often connected to fears of death and improper burial. So most vampire myths from the old times are somewhere in the lower left corner. Through the spread of vampire myths and legends, however, the creatures made it into literature and art and came to represent something entirely different. For a long time, specifically and most tangibly from the 19th century onwards, vampires carried connotations of sexual, racial, and class anxieties. The fanged fiends were outsiders, the others, threatening the proper world order. The 19th century, for example, gave us Stoker's Dracula, Polidori's the Vampire, and Le Fanu's Carmilla, and one of these is not like the others. While all of the named examples are representative of the sexual anxieties and class tensions mentioned earlier, Dracula specifically is notable due to its vampire being a very clearly racialized other. The Count carries a distinctly foreign threat to the Victorian ideas of order and propriety, corrupting the pure women and planning to reign supreme. If you think about it, he's kind of the first Eastern European immigrant stealing jobs in women. Like, oh my god, he's so me, you don't get it. This, while not that different from the old-timey bloodsuckers, somewhat moves up and to the right here, seeing as Count Dracula does contain elements of sensuality and intimacy, and is driven not solely by vampirism, but by his human nature too. You know, sometimes your human nature is just also not nice. The Dracula-like notions of vampires as racialized others continued to dominate the fang-centric art until the 20th century, when through a variety of factors like frequency of mention, easing of the sexual and, in part, racial tensions, and general increase in tolerance for what the vampire represented, the bloodsucker figure underwent a process of domestication, becoming rather romantic than threatening. This then shifts the focus to pre-existing molds of Byronic and Byron-esque vampires, such as Polidori's Lord Ruthven, at the same time emphasizing the tragic aspects of the vampire figure and sympathizing with it.
Like, ooh, it's sexy. It's scary sexy. You're scared of how hot it makes you.
Most notably, Anne Rice's bloodsuckers present a very wide spectrum of melancholic pansexual queens whose humanity often has to wrestle with their fanged nature. Polidori's vampire, for example, is noticeably higher up than Stoker's, and Anne Rice's Louis and Lestat, as I'd argue, occupy the upper right quadrant. The domestication of the vampire myth is then also responsible for bringing to the surface the link between queerness and vampirism. As Carlin Levine writes for Journal of Dracula Studies, with the discovery of HIV and AIDS, first associated with the lifestyles of gay men, blood became a source of horror not through the images of splattered gore, but through the creeping threat of decay, and blood is the focus and sustaining drive of vampiric existence. The literally link between queer, undead, and blood became juxtaposed onto the suddenly immediate links between queer, blood, and HIV. Jennifer's Body, which is a vampire movie to me, and I do not care if it isn't to you, is distinctly 2000s and heavy on the queer themes and the homoerotic relationship between the two main characters. And Jennifer herself is cursed by vampirism, yet violent, which is not that common of a combination. This is a post-MCR example, but I wanted a complete picture. And fuck it, let's throw in a Gerard Way tweet into the mix. Wake up, drink blood, fave art. I'd put this smack dab in the middle of the y-axis and a little to the left of the x-axis. Here you go. And while different versions of shadowy figures of bloodsuckers have coexisted, coexist, and will continue to coexist, sometimes even within the same piece, the most prominent vampires of the late 1990s and early 2000s are fully domesticated and, at times, defanged. They do not carry a foreign threat, nor are they seen as vicious or corrupt and corrupting, at least to the same degree as the ruthless 19th century vamps. The vampire is a sympathetic and tragic character, doomed by vampirism instead of driven by it. Trevor Holmes, associate director at the University of Waterloo, for instance, puts it the following way. There is a peculiar mix at work in the end of the millennium reanimations of the vampire figure, a mix that includes embodied decadence, cynical neo-romanticism, HIV, savvy camp, and, I would add, a post-punk aesthetic. These tragic, very human in their suffering and morality, and often queer vampires reigned supreme at the time when MCR was formed in late 2001. And it's not surprising that the band's first single, Vampires Will Never Hurt You, centers the sympathetic, tortured vampire. The 2002 single Vampires Will Never Hurt You, the very first in MCR's career, might I add, tells a tragic tale of a vampire in love with a human. Most notably, the lyrical subject of the song is the vampire in question, and we as listeners assume their point of view for the first and last time in the band's discography. With lyrics like, "Someone get me to the doctor, someone get me to a church where they can't hold this thing I have, can't be home." And it's impossible to deny the sympathetic vampire of it all. It should be noted, however, that the bloodsucker saying all this is presented as in opposition to both other vamps and people waging war on them within the song, referring to both groups as a faceless, violent, and dangerous they. Oh my god, that's so me, to be honest. I am a dangerous they. Yeah. The lyrical subject is doomed in their vampirism because they're somewhat of a bloodsucker pick-me, struggling against their undead nature and afraid of losing their humanity entirely. Hence the... Vampires Will Never Hurt You, then, is not an affirmative statement about the benevolent nature of the undead, but a promise given to the still human lover. Geoff Rickley of Thursday fame, who actually produced MCR's first album entitled I Brought You My Bullets, You Brought Me Your Love, said the following about the band's use of supernatural and undead imagery. There's the superficial theme to it, whether that's vampires or whatever, and behind that, the song is actually about something more personal, like how Gerard is afraid that his little brother might get AIDS or something like that. Everything had deeper meaning. Confirming this, Gerard Way shared in a 2004 interview with Dot Out magazine that the band uses vampires as a metaphor for something else, something deeper than just the supernatural. Continuing, there's just something about the blood-sucking Walking Dead that can say so much to people. There are really so many people trying to get control over you on a daily basis and steal your soul in some way, take a part of you. Vampirism and vampires in general, then, are a corrupting and threatening force, yet the lyrical subject of the song would place somewhere in the upper right quadrant, seeing as they are cursed by being the undead and actually fear becoming driven by their vampire nature and joining the legion of other bloodsuckers they perceive to be dangerous and pointedly unhuman. This way, while the narrator is the embodiment of a sympathetic vampire, the other bloodsucking beasts take on a characterization closer to their Victorian Gothic form. This song, as well as Early Sunset sets over Monroeville, which does skew a little more zombie, as Gerard Way later said, would come to define the image of the band. It brought in the entire gothic thing. It was those songs that made people think we were a vampire band. The music video for the single further solidified the link between MCR and all things gothic and horror-y, because they were consciously trying to evoke the aesthetic of German Expressionism. You know, the genre that famously gave us Nosferatu.
Us and the Eyeball guys, we built the sets and we wanted it to look like Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, but we didn't quite have enough room.
Additionally, when MCR's first album was released, the CD said, "Unauthorized duplication is a violation of applicable laws and will result in Gerard coming to your house and sucking your blood." Which, while being a humorous little detail, played into the connection between the black and red wearing fake blood-drenched musicians and the black and red wearing real blood-drenched monsters. This would, however, be the first and last time we'd see a sympathetic vampire within MCR lyrical canon, because the band gradually grew to low-key resent the cloak-wearing figures over the course of their Please Spirit career. The corrupting and corrupted vamps were nothing new, but from My Chemical Romance's second album on, there wasn't going to be a bloodsucker that still retained any of their humanity. The band's sophomore album, 3 Cheers for Sweet Revenge, also known as
Sweet Threes for Cheers Revenge,
while being incredibly important to MCR being crowned as vampire royalty, does not mention the bloodsuckers once. Initially conceptualized as a story of a man, a woman, and the corpses of 1,000 evil men, the record was heavily impacted by the Way brothers' grandma passing away.
The album it's roughly half a concept and half about our lives. Started off as a full concept, really just ended up, so much stuff happened in our lives that we ended up writing about that.
And now my fucking 3 Cheers CD has fake blood on it. Yum. The conceptual side of 3 Cheers, also known as
Queers, Cheers, Blood, Revenge. The devil's here, I think,
is undeniably vampiric, as it deals with death, revenge, and all the fake blood Creolan had in stock. In short, it's a story continuing the tale of demolition lovers who first appeared on Bullets. There's a man who loses his lover, and then, to use Gerard Way's own words, he has to bring the devil the souls of 1,000 evil men to get his love back from the dead. So he goes on a killing spree, which ends in him realizing that he is the final evil man who's gonna die so that his lover can live. I mean, she's not really dead, but we don't have time to unpack all of that. That 1,000th evil man plot is also something that was added to the canon retroactively, as evident from this 2005 Black Velvet interview, where Gerard said, "It's weird because I never came up with an ending to the story. I'm sure a lot of people saw this coming, but I never realized it." So obviously he kills 999 evil men, and then he realizes the last evil man he has to kill is himself. I thought of that and was like, man, why didn't I think of that before? There's also a gay song or 2 on there, or 3. Or all of them. I don't fucking know. More to that, the story evoked the very familiar bloodsucker imagery. From 3 Cheers onwards, blood, the very thing that makes vampires tick, takes on a new meaning in the band's lyrics, starting to signify something that, when staining, remains forever as a reminder of one's corruption, sins, and life beyond redemption. Like here. And here. But more importantly to the topic of this video, blood also starts to represent life itself. So bloodsuckers, as I mentioned before, return to their Victorian version, the one where they are driven by vampirism and violent, totally opposed to the sympathetic vamp we saw in the lyrical subject of Vampires Will Never Hurt You. Blood, the hidden track of MCR's third album entitled The Black Parade, is probably the best example of this. And yeah, it's another concept album, but this time depicting a man dying of cancer.
The Black Parade is also the very basic premise of the record, which is when you die, I'd like to think that when you die, death comes for you however you want. So when death comes for him, it comes in the form of a black parade.
Within the lyrics of the song, the patient, its main character, recounts his experience with his own version of vampires, doctors that surround him in the hospital. There's no quenching this thirst they have, draining the patient's life and promising salvation that never comes. And interestingly enough, the song switches from second to first person perspective in its second chorus. This can be read as the author breaking out of the confines of the lyrical subject and directly addressing the listeners, talking about the sacrifice they are making as an artist, letting the audience in the scene drain them of their blood, just like the patient lets the doctors and nurses drain him. Considering that the track starts up after a whole minute and a half of silence after the last song of the album, it assumes the words fall on the ears of the most dedicated and tuned-in listeners in a somewhat more intimate atmosphere. The lyrical subject / author's words, then, are directed towards the core of the fandom, rather than any and all passersby. You had to be a pretty big fucking nerd to discover the track, either by sitting through the silence or by interacting with other members of the fandom. So the perspective switch really emphasizes who the bloodsucker is. And that's you. This idea is similarly touched on in This Is How I Disappear, specifically in the following lyric. The scene and the fans take on the role of the vampire. I mean, Gerard Way didn't call bloodsuckers the coolest metaphor in the world for nothing, but the ultimate blow to the sympathetic vampire figure came, of course, in 2010 with the release of Danger Days, which contained the song Vampire Money. Known by its legal name, Danger Days, The True Lives of the Fabulous Killjoys, it's another concept album. I mean, what do you expect? One that depicts a ragtag band of rebels by the name of Killjoys and their fight against the big bad corporation and its minions in a post-apocalyptic California in 2019, largely interpreted as a critique of consumerism and capitalism. But what's new? Danger Days as a record plays around with the world of Killjoys, a companion comic that was announced in 2009. The comic was conceptualized first, but the two ended up kind of informing each other and refining the final product. Basically, it's a whole chicken and egg situation. The big bad corporation's minions, I should add, are literally called Draculoids, with the process entitled Draculoidization literally sucking every last drop of humanity out of them. I mean, they could have made it clearer if they tried. The vampire figure, this time dressed up in a fuck-ass rubber mask and a white suit, represents the evils of rampant capitalism and conformity, reflecting the anxieties of the artists and society at large, just as they, almost, always do. But that's not the extent of it on MCR's fourth album. Initially been a stripped-back rock record, later released as a part of compilation album in 2012, Danger Days was scrapped and reworked, and ultimately described by Gerard Way as a rebellion.
It's a rebellion against ourselves and kind of definitely against being assimilated into modern rock culture and cutting your hair and looking respectable and getting into your 30s and like, all right, we're gonna be this kind of rock band because that's what people are grooming us to be.
This rebellion, in part, came in the form of a middle finger to the Twilight franchise. And worry not, for we'll discuss MCR's relationship with Twilight in a different chapter. While Vampire Money is a comment on the state of the scene and the showbiz at large, it takes some very obvious stabs at Cullen & Company with lyrics such as and the song simultaneously makes fun of the modern-day depictions of the vampire figure and points to those it considers real bloodsuckers. That is to say, those who want to sell you a fuck-ass Team Edward t-shirt. Mine is borrowed, of course. Other than Vampire Money, the band makes another reference to the role money plays in the whole vampire capitalism order within the album. And that's honestly so Marxian of them. Like, I made a whole video on capitalist vampires, but TLDR, Marx himself wrote, "Capital is dead labor," which, vampire-like, lives only by sucking live-in labor, and lives the more labor it sucks. My Chemical Comrades? Anyhow, Danger Days and Vampire Money in particular is not only a piece of meta-commentary on the scene, but also a piece of meta-commentary on the transformation of the vampire figure in pop culture, situating the band as opposed to the commodification and defanging of vampires, as evident from this 2010 NME interview. That's why the song Vampire Money is on there, because there's a lot of people chasing that fucking money. Twilight? A lot of people around us were like, please, for the love of God, do this fucking movie. but we've moved on because you loathe what goth has become. Originally, what we did was take goth and put it with punk and turn it into something dangerous and sexy. We did it because we had one mission: to polarize, to irritate, to contaminate. It's like, who's the toughest guy in the club? Us, because we're dressed like fucking cupcakes. But then that image gets romanticized, and then it gets commoditized. So gradually, MCR shifted from a singular sympathetic vampire and some light-hearted fanged references to being in opposition to the cloak-clad shadowy figures. About a decade and a half later, however, the band would perform as reanimated corpses of their older selves at the 2022 When We Were Young Fest, bringing the lyric to life and poking fun at the vampiric nature of fame and nostalgia. The merch sold at the festival, I should add, also featured the aged-up versions of Demolition Lovers, as well as the word merch in all caps, adding another meta element to the blood-draining stunt. Mikey Way, notably, was the only person to not have dressed up and SFX'd to the gods, instead presenting as a vampire himself. Now, what does that mean for the role of the vampire within My Chemical Romance lore? We can read that as the band coming to terms with the space the vamps occupy within their art and the fanon that surrounds them, showcasing that while painting themselves as in complete opposition to the supposed vampires, they are also participating in the vampiric activity. This was emphasized by literal vampire money that rained on the crowd at the end of MCR's set as the band was performing the Twilight Disney track as the closer. Wear my fucking balls off. It's 25 degrees outside and I cannot open the window because of the sound. So if I look miserable, that's because I am. Other than being textually connected to bloodsuckers, My Chemical Romance's curated aesthetic fits the vampire figure like a glove. Gerard Way even said MCR were almost tailor-made for that vampire gothic movement, and there were several factors at play. Firstly, the way MCR dressed. Have you seen this shit? Post The Lost Boys vampires, as depicted in the media, and film specifically, were generally quite punk adjacent in their edgy dress. All black and leather with red blood dripping from their faces, acting as the accent color.
Would you wear this to the club? No. But would you wear this to the club? Absolutely. And you're probably gonna get offered poppers.
Think 1998 Blade or 2002 Queen of the Damned, which both showcase that style of cool and leather-clad vampires, with the latter specifically mixing the various alternative subcultures into the vampire pod. I also have an entire video on that movie, so go watch it after this one, or click it here. I'm having so much fun with this. The pale, black and leather-wearing rock band had a certain predisposition to being associated with bloodsuckers, and it was becoming all the more apparent when MCR entered the era of their second studio album entitled 3 Cheers for Sweet Revenge, also known as
Sweet Cheers for 3 Revenge again. God damn it. Okay.
2004 to 2005 is probably the most vampiric or vampire-adjacent era of MCR's visuals, with Gerard performing covered in fake, or at times, real blood.
There was a time where I was pouring fake blood on myself to emulate the guy on the cover of the record.
And the band's aesthetic gradually evolving into something more coherent with a limited color palette, mostly utilizing black, white, and red.
We're not vampires, and that's the main thing. Because we have one song about vampires on the first record, and it became, alright, so we wear a lot of black, right? But we're wearing colors today.
Secondly, the very imagery that surrounded the album was undeniably vampiric. I mean, look at the blood-smeared face on the cover of I'm Not Okay, the first single from the album, or the album art itself. That is a vampire couple, if I've ever seen one! Also, I should add, the Bullets merch included a t-shirt that featured vampire teeth, if you need an example of a more obvious connection. More to that, the 3 Cheers era has the highest concentration of mentions of vampires in interviews, from questions about who is cooler, vampires or werewolves.
Vampires or werewolves?
Vampires.
Werewolves.
Pirates.
Yeah, I like werewolves better, actually. I'll go with werewolves.
Oh, traitor.
To joke and insinuations that the band members themselves are vampires. A lot of people seem to think you're vampires, but if you could really be any supernatural creature, what would you be? And finally, the presence of Catholic imagery, which in the Western, European, and American canon is heavily associated with bloodsuckers, despite, of course, having nothing to do with the vampire myths, which originated in regions that were often predominantly pagan. Again, we don't have time to unpack all of that. If you look to the classics of the Western vampire canon, however, you'll see that the connection between the fanged undead and Catholic imagery and rituals has been there pretty much since the beginning, or at least the adoption of the vampire myth. Like, Van Helsing uses sacred wafers in an attempt to cure Mina after she's been bitten by Dracula, and the 1931 adaptation of the movie, as well as pretty much every other vampire flick, depicts the vamp having a visceral reaction to seeing a crucifix. My Chemical Romance's lyrics, visuals, and performances, which often reference religious themes and Catholic imagery specifically, tie into the vampire link. And throughout the years, we can kind of see 3 stages of the band acknowledging this connection to the blood-sucking beasts that was bestowed upon them. Just like third wave emo is incredibly meta and self-referential, MCR is a very meta and self-referential band, keenly aware of their fandom and the discourse surrounding their art, as we'll see throughout this progression. Stage 1. They came from outer Jersey. Initially, we see the band flirt with the whole bloodsucker thing, from bad belt buckles to white face paint and fake blood practically becoming the 6th band member. Here, the vampire aesthetic is rather accidental than curated, but not shunned or shut down in a jokey manner.
The biggest misconception about My Chemical Romance is that we are vampires. People think we're rich vampires.
Closer to the end of this period, in 2004 and 5, however, you can definitely see them start getting fed up with this. For example, in a 2004 interview with Black Velvet, Gerard Way said that the band has kind of moved away from the vampire thing. Which brings us to stage 2. Vampires are the new Jonas Brothers. This stage is largely a reaction towards the fact that the public, seemingly, was not letting the vampire thing go, as well as to the transformation of the vampire figure in popular media. Mostly, this had everything to do with Twilight exploding in popularity, which we'll get into in detail in the next chapter, so put a pin in that. But for now, I'll just say that this period bears a certain resentment to, as Gerard Way put it, vampires losing their edge and gothic allure, and the band being dragged into the newly exploded sparkly vampire phenomenon against their will. We see a lot of attempts to visually and textually distance the band from bloodsuckers, with MCR reinventing themselves from album to album. I mean, just look at the Black Parade era costumes or the swarm of colors on Danger Days. The vampstumes are relegated to Halloween gimmicks, such as this simple vampire cloak worn by Frank Caiero at Voodoo Music Festival in 2011. Notably also, it is during this period that Gerard Way talks shit about Twilight on Twitter, writing, "Always worth mentioning that Edward Cullen is 1,000 years old dating a 17-year-old. The shade of it all. Stage 3. Pool boy at the vampire mansion. Look how the turntables. MCR's reunion, which interestingly coincided with the vampire renaissance we're currently living through, has revitalized the band's relationship to bloodsuckers and given it a more light-hearted, meta-ironic edge. The band has only released 1 single since officially coming back. However, the vampire imagery we've been witnessing since the reunion marks a completely new stage in the way MCR treats their fanged friends. My Chemical Romance's 2022 reunion tour is of interest to us due to Gerard Way's stage outfits, many of which were curated by award-winning designer Marina Toibina, and none of which were accidental. As Toibina shared in an interview with Alternative Press, when we got together for a creative meeting, Gerard already had very set ideas and specific characters he wanted to play with. Everything was very specific and strategic, which I enjoyed, down to the right socks with each outfit, the right colors, fabrics, and medallions for Dracula. The tour showcased the reanimation of the whole vampires are the best beast you can be attitude, as well as the band kind of broadening their vampire horizons. Let me explain. While we have seen some more of the traditionally gothic and edgy vamp imagery in Gerard's costumes, such as old school Dracula and Cunty Bat, there's also been an Edward Cullen t-shirt, and most importantly, this. Now, Twilight merch and a DIY t-shirt that says "Pool Boy at the Vampire Mansion" might not seem like much, but what really brings the whole thing together is that while wearing the Cullen shirt, Way introduced the song "Vampires Will Never Hurt You" by reading the beginning of the first novel of the Vampire Chronicles, Interview with the Vampire, on stage.
Oh, fuck. I'm blind as shit. I see you, said the vampire thoughtfully. and slowly he walked across the room toward the window.
This was like the Super Bowl for people who used to wear a black shirt and red tie combo to middle school on a daily basis. And I mean myself, of course. We also see the band playing around with vampire imagery in merch again, like in the case of this top. So while originally a lot of the bloodsucker imagery surrounding the band was rather accidental or not intended to be read as purely vampiric, the current day interplay between MCR and vampires is pointedly curated and deliberate. Three Cheers might have been the most vampire-adjacent aesthetic-wise, but this third stage is the first time the band is playing around with explicitly vampy motifs and pieces of media, while also acknowledging the place they have within the bloodsucker realm. And it's also the first time that acknowledgement does not seem to contain any sort of venom or negativity, which obviously has not always been the case. Yes, it is finally time to talk about Twilight. Twilight, while being a worldwide phenomenon, is also very divisive in the vampire world. I mean, like, arguably, the Cullens aren't even vampires to begin with. They have a completely random assortment of powers, they sparkle in the sun, and they're often thought of as partly responsible for, as well as emblematic of, the complete domestication of the bloodsucker myth. Chiho Nakagawa refers to the Twilight vampires as defanged, pointing to how the saga's treatment of Bella is a regression, politically speaking, from the feminist outlook of Buffy the Vampire Slayer a decade before. The discourse surrounding Twilight is active to this day, and while covering it is so fucking far beyond the scope of this video, one thing I think is important to highlight is the Move to Higher Ground initiative of the Quileute tribe, whose name and stories Meyer misrepresented, bastardized, and ultimately used for her own gain. The Quileute people were not compensated in any way, shape, or form, nor were they listened to by Meyer when they voiced their concerns and disagreements with their portrayal. So, you know, fuck you, Stephanie Meyer. The Move to Higher Ground initiative is currently working towards moving the tribe away from the tsunami zone, which poses danger to their very existence. So I encourage you all to check out the initiative and donate at mthg.org. So, what does American rock band My Chemical Romance have to do with sparkly Robert Pattinson? Well, kind of a lot, but pretty much none of it has been intentional. You're probably familiar with the 9/11 to 50 Shades of Grey to Downfall of Ellen chart, which draws a direct line from 9/11 to MCR to Twilight. But this, as well as the 9/11 to Downfall of the European Portuguese accent, is something I will be getting into over on my Patreon. Give me money. The boom of Twilight coincided with the boom of bands generally grouped under the third wave of emo umbrella, which MCR was a part of. Twilight, the first book of the saga, was released in 2005 and quickly became incredibly successful. At that same time, MCR was flaunting their signature vampiric Three Cheers visuals, which combined with both of the phenomena audiences being composed of young adults, led to the two being connected by virtue of simply existing at the same time. The fact that My Chemical Romance, as we have established, have been playing around with vampires and vampire-adjacent topics pretty much since their inception did not help either. Notably, in 2007, during the search for the one and only Edward, Stephanie Meyer posted to her website saying, "I've seen some nice suggestions, but keep in mind a few reality checks. I'm not considering anyone over 21, or anyone who isn't a real actor. This counts out all the lead singers too, Gerard Way lovers." This is, as far as I'm aware, the first time Meyer acknowledged the connection people were making between the band and the Twilight books. 2 years later, in 2009, Meyer named My Chemical Romance as one of her Twilight inspirations, writing, "This band is so in touch for me with Jacob's character, this really raw, uncontrolled emotion." The song Famous Last Words is a really romantic version of Jacob saying, "Okay, I'm putting myself out there and you're probably going to break me, but that doesn't change the fact that I'm still going to make the offer." Around that same time, Meyer and the team behind the movie adaptation of New Moon began shopping around for a contemporary soundtrack. And they made an offer to MCR, who Meyer was self-admittedly a fan of. Now, this was after Paramore did the first movie. Decode was a certified banger, and the stacks of checks cashed off of that movie went to the moon and fucking back. So My Chemical Romance on the soundtrack was not... What? Come here, baby. Yeah. So My Chemical... Stop, hey. so My Chemical Romance on the soundtrack was not that far out of the realm of possibility. They, however, wanted nothing to do with New Moon. Why are you staring at me? This, then, gave us two emo songs that reflect vastly different attitudes towards Twilight. The first one is, of course, Decode by Paramore. In 2022, Hayley Williams called the movie's peak camp and said that the release of Twilight opened Paramore up to a slew of fans that probably wouldn't have given them a chance before, or that didn't know they existed before. The second song is, as I've mentioned in an earlier chapter, Vampire Money by MCR, later described as shit, ... I'm real mad about Twilight on this, ... by Gerard Way on Twitter. The band had certain gripes with being associated with sparkly vamps, and the more the fandom tried to marry the two, the further away they tried to get. Ray Toro, specifically, insinuated the phrase vampire money was used in conversation as shorthand for Twilight cash grab, and the anxieties around selling out and losing the audience's trust and or interest seemed to be a big reason for the band rejecting the offer. Vampire Money, while being a critique of the larger patterns surrounding cultural and media production, does contain jabs aimed directly at Twilight and its defanged vampires. Most importantly, shots were taken at the saga's focus on the visual signifiers of a vampire, and at the famously glittery skin of a killer, Bella. Part of the reason the band bore such resentment towards the franchise was that, as Gerard Way put it, the idea of anything gothic like vampires wasn't scary anymore. They were sexy or contemplative. Way even went on to say, to me, vampires are the new Jonas Brothers. Are you smelling this? Is this? No, it can't be. Fuck! It's time for me to kind of slightly, lukewarmly defend Twilight. Get behind me, Bella! Girl, get behind me! I should add that I have no stakes in this game. I've seen maybe like 20 minutes of each Twilight movie at most. They just put me to sleep. I will watch them one day, but I truly do not give a fuck about Twilight. Emo, as Sam Dubois highlights in Cheer Up Emo Kid, Rethinking the Crisis of Masculinity in Emo, positions itself outside of the jock masculinities typically exhibited in rock, yet at the same time, it is characterized by beta male misogyny, which implies resistance to traditional, some may say hegemonic, forms of behavior in order to achieve the same desired outcomes as those perceived as traditionally masculine. Point is, while the emo scene was often positioned as intrinsically different to your usual motley crew types, it was full of largely the same misogynistic attitudes, but like slightly rebranded. Men with guitars famously do not know shit, and the testimonies of women active in the scene are proof of that. As Jessica Hopper writes for Rookie magazine, girls in emo songs today did not have names. We are not identified beyond our absence, our shape drawn by the pain we've caused. We're vessels redeemed in the light of boy love, on a pedestal, on our backs. Muses at best, comrades or invisible at worst. Emo's penchant for stage gay and exhibits of theatrical homoeroticism and femininity similarly did not actually mean an embrace of femininity or a celebration of women in the scene. As Buddy Nielsen of Census Fail puts it, the fashion was to dress a little more androgynous or feminine, while also writing lyrics about killing girls. Kind of a weird juxtaposition. So Twilight, having the reputation of a teenage girl saga, was never going to be taken seriously or accepted by the scene. It was seen as below real emo fans, and Gerard Way equating Twilight vamps to Jonas Brothers, a band that was considered silly pop for teenage girls, is indicative of this type of attitude. Now get away from the keyboard, away! I'm not calling Gerard Way misogynist. MCR are actually some of the lesser offenders on this particular front, but the comparison draws attention to the general perception of Twilight within emo circles. Similarly, Hayley Williams shared that despite being a fan of the books, she was worried about Paramore's reputation potentially suffering due to their involvement with the movie. There was part of me that read the books, I loved them, they were easy reads and they were fun. It was, holy shit, we have a song in the movie, that was crazy. And then the resentment set in, like, oh my god, we're the Twilight band. It took a long time to get over that part of myself that wanted to be like, you're a poser. The more recent waves of Twilight discourse have pointed to the role misogyny played in the backlash against it, and as I theorize, that applies to the emo versus Twilight showdown that resulted in Decode and Vampire Money. Twilight was doomed to be a laughingstock of the scene, not only because of its defanged bloodsuckers, but also because of its young female readership. Arguably, the two were quite often seen as one, like girls cannot handle real vampires. And while the saga features vampires that barely resemble their gothic predecessors, I don't think Vampire Money would have been so bold in sticking its middle finger up Cullen's ass if the soundtrack offer came from a more respectable piece of vampire media. Allegedly, in my opinion. We will never know. Nowadays, as already mentioned, we do see the band making peace with Twilight and the fact that their legacies are, to a degree, intertwined. But who's responsible for that connection? The fandom, which played a huge part in shaping MCR's vampire legacy. So for a closer, let's talk about fanfiction, early 2000s internet, and vampire subjectivity. MCR was part of a generation of emo bands whose success was heavily with a capital H, contributed to by fandom on the internet. Napster, which was a peer-to-peer music sharing site, was launched in 1999 and changed the outreach independent and/or small artists could have. As Chris Carrabba of Dashboard Confessionals describes it, without Napster, you had to have some kind of professional foothold, like your label has distribution to get stores to stock your record. Napster was the great equalizer, this genuine peer-to-peer sharing. That gave me a fighting chance. Post-Napster emo bands were networked in a completely different way from their predecessors. Oh, but MCR said they're not emo. The only real emo is actually the 90s scene in Washington. Shut up! Shut the fuck up! Go outside and touch some grass now! I'm gonna quote Andy Greenwald, as I always do, and say, every generation that loves emo bands simultaneously rejects the term while claiming ownership of it. Meaning, even if they won't admit that they love emo, they certainly will say how much they hate everything that's been called emo since then. But still, no one knows what it is. Similarly, as Mikey Way reminisced about the band's past attitude towards the label, we wanted to be a rock band. At the time, we were at odds with the term emo, and we did everything we could, kicking and screaming, to get away from it. Over the years, the band's attitude towards the term mellowed out, of course, and now they are more or less at peace with the fact that, whether they like it or not, MCR is known as an emo band.
The emo thing was around for a while, and like that, we understood that, so we were only angry about it for it felt like a couple years. You know, like Pearl Jam didn't want to be called grunge, but they still mention it when they mention their name.
Now that I've done the mandatory arguing about the definition of emo detour, let's log back in. My point is that the third wave of emo was the first to have been in touch with their fandom in a very constant and intense fashion. For the first time ever, the spaces used by bands and fans were intertwined, if not the same. And while fan communication has existed since forever, and fan spaces always had spillover into band spaces and vice versa, the sheer scale of it all was unprecedented. Pete Wentz was on that damn live journal like he was getting paid per character. This generation of emo bands, then, was more than ever aware of the fan discussions surrounding everything that had to do with them, and interacted with the fandom in an often meta fashion, i.e. Vampire Money, as discussed in the previous section. Therefore, I would argue, an examination of the bloodsuckers produced, negotiated, and reproduced in the emo fandom is in order. Dr. Judith Fathalla from Lancaster University highlights something I found really interesting in their research on emo fandom. Fathalla points out that sympathetic vampires were dominating the bloodsucker landscape at the time of MCR's rise. Later, of course, defanged would be added to the description. And not only were they the vampires of the era, but their ubiquitous, looming presence turned them into meta figures, meaning the sympathetic vampire was read even into texts that did not warrant it. Thus, emo's interplay with the motif was doomed to be viewed through the lens of the brooding, kinda moral, and kinda sexy and sensual vamps, and not based on specific authorial intent, which varied on a case-by-case basis. Combine that with certain bands, MCR among them, penchant for stage gay, and various other manifestations of homoeroticism, MCR's largely queer fandom, and the queer vampire legacy, and we got the perfect foundation for a 150-chapter vampire x vampire hunter long burn, which includes sensual fang touching. As Fat Halla points out in their analysis of fanfiction within the so-called emo trinity fandoms, the details of the vampire figure featured in the band's lyrics, performances, and videos did not matter much in terms of fanfiction production. The sympathetic vampire, literal or metaphoric, is certainly a stock figure in emo fandom. I should also add that MCR vampire fanfiction absolutely knocks the other bands out of the park based on number of kudos, a metric that typically indicates longevity and long-lasting popularity. And I mean, I literally have an MCR Vampires Will Never Hurt You fanzine by Ben Rose right here. You'll never guess, it's all vampire themed. Shout out to Ben Rose, by the way. Based on Fat Halla's analysis of the most popular vampire fandom fanfiction in AO3, the typical vamp, just like the typical emo frontman, is a white man.
A white man? No!
Who pretty much has all the subjectivity of the story, similar to how the overwhelming majority of the lyrical subjects of emo are the broken-hearted suburban white boys. Will please somebody help the broken-hearted suburban white boys? And despite the prevalence of queer women in fanfic production, we can see recreations of the beta male misogyny discussed earlier. Within emo vampire fanfiction, women are largely treated as props, and their perspectives are absent from the narrative. But this rises to the surface most clearly when it comes to how the fanfics treat feminized vampire texts, such as Twilight. This discussion is getting too fucking meta. Like, there's layers to this shit, player. Tiramisu. Citing quotes such as, like some kind of demented vampire romance heroine, and 3 shades of changing your name to Bella and writing angst-ridden poetry in a spiral-bound notebook, Fat Halla points to the fact that while a lot of emo vampire fanfiction poses gender as irrelevant, when examined closer, there actually tends to be a structure of masculinism inherited from emo, i.e. a performance of gender equality that silently privileges the male and masculine perspective. Furthermore, whiteness and paleness carry a fetishized value within the fandom, which, once again, pairs particularly nicely with the Three Cheers aesthetic.
You're trying to make yourself as dead-looking as possible.
Did you go to clown college for this, or?
I went to art school.
Ah, yes. Same thing?
Basically.
When it comes to themes, vampire morality and personhood are the 2 biggest ones after romanticism, and monstrosity, more often than not, is not ontological and comes from actions, which sometimes leads to the whole not like other vampires situation we witnessed in Vampires Will Never Hurt You. This, then, also reinforces the ubiquity of the sympathetic vampire as a meta-figure, and most importantly, influences the vamps featured in the emo band's art. Remember what I said about the third weight of emo bands being uniquely tuned into their fandom's activities? Fanfiction is only a corner in the big room that is fandom, of course, and I'm not making a case that any of the specific fics analyzed by Fat Halla have influenced the band's treatment of the bloodsucker figure, but the analysis serves as a great foundation for understanding the fan-produced MCR vamp. Also, it gives me the opportunity to read out one of the tweets of all time. Enjoy your fic. Write one about me and a human centipede would escape the fate. I don't give a fuck. These emo generations, and MCR's in particular, awareness of the fandom production, practices, and discussions, then results in an Ouroboros of sorts, with the fandom reacting to the band's art, and the bands reacting to the fandom in their art, and all of that being influenced by the meta figure of the sympathetic vampire. And like the devil's also there, I think. Fandom and its depictions of the MCR vamps then definitely influenced the band's treatment of the vampire figure, both in their art and general presence, and possibly helped move the sympathetic bloodsuckers completely out of frame of MCR's lyrics. I mean, the band was rebelling against the label of emo that was bestowed upon them, going so far as to call it a pile of shit. And it's quite plausible that their disdain of moral and or defanged vamps was, in part, a reaction to the sympathetic vampire figure bestowed upon them. So where does all this leave us then? And let me be frank. Okay, let me actually be frank with you. I don't fucking know. MCR's relationship and interplay with vampires is extremely complex and influenced by an absolutely ginormous variety of factors. But at the same time, it kind of seems meant to be. Like, your band's very first single is called Vampires Will Never Hurt You, and you all look like the Lost Boys extras, and then you're pissed that people want you to do the soundtrack for the brand new popular vampire franchise? This isn't even a fork found in kitchen type of debacle. This warrants a full cutlery discovered at the restaurant. My Chemical Romance having enough vampire lore for like an almost hour-long video? I said I'm sure. Yeah. That's the conclusion. Go give me some money on Patreon or something so I can maybe recoup the cost of this godforsaken green screen.